Oops. Okay, sorry. Okay, so AI in healthcare is particularly promising because AI tools and models can combine knowledge of thousands of clinicians and millions of patient records. So maybe before I continue my slide, really simple question like, can any one of you can think of an example of where AI could help in the hospital, for example, in hospital use case? Maybe you can put some answers in the chat, like really simple applications. Okay, I see data privacy. Were you facing, like, I don't know, creating some AI models for different applications? Anyway, so I will continue. Maybe if you have some ideas that come to your mind, answering patient inquiries. All right, cool. Okay, so I will give some examples of these applications. So first, for example, as you know that there are not two patients that are the same, and AI models can help us to personalize treatments. Oops. To individuals with like specific genetics, history, or lifestyle, for example. Then by finding hidden patterns in the data, AI tools can predict complications earlier or suggest the right drug at the right dose or anticipate some patient outcomes. AI models can also detect some details that expert eyes might miss. They can support clinicians and doctors in making more accurate diagnoses, for example. As you know also, hospitals generate a lot of data every day, and these tools can automate repetitive tasks like image screening, for example. They can help prioritize urgent cases and let doctors spend more time with patients. These tools can also help decrease the number of errors that simply happen because of work overload, for example. And it's not just about hospitals. There are more and more applications that allow patients to track their own health, for example, from watch or any style like this. And machine learning models can help to interpret their data and help people in managing their health or well-being in general. So obviously these tools are not here to replace doctors, it's not the question. But just to give them and give patients better tools to make smarter and safer decisions. So machine learning in healthcare is powerful and important, but it's clearly not trivial due to real-world obstacles. So here we have listed several key challenges. So as you know, medical data often requires expect annotation, like for example, a radiologist making tumors annotations. And this process is quite expensive, is really time consuming, and is subject to human subjectivity. Moreover, datasets are really rarely perfect. Sometimes there are patients that drop out from the studies. Sometimes you have some populations that are underrepresented. Sometimes data are censored for privacy reasons. And all these reasons together lead to really scarce datasets. And then in the end, maybe non-powerful AI models. Then a single hospital visit can generate many types of data, like lab results, clinical reports, images, or genetics, all in different formats. And it's the same for different hospitals with different types of machines and setups. And this leads to highly heterogeneous datasets. And this is quite a big obstacle of AI models. Another point is that unlike other domains, medical data is highly sensitive. So we cannot just centralize this data like in other domains. And this also leads to quite regulatory complexity. There is another interesting point that compared to other domains, maybe here correlation is not enough in medicine. We don't want to just predict who will get sick statistically, but we want to understand more what is the underlying cause and mechanisms, if they are. Then there is a problem of reproducibility. For example, two hospitals running the same experiment often get different results. We can also expect some different results from the same patient due to intravariability, for example, and also the variations in equipment, in patient demographics, or even in environment make reproducibility in healthcare a real problem. And last but not the least, there are really deployment issues. So even if you have a great model, hospitals often run on closed software systems. And this integration of new AI tools in these environments is quite difficult in practice. Well, all of this to say that collaboration matters. No single hospital or lab can deal with all these obstacles alone. And we need some ways to share knowledge and learn together without compromising the security or the privacy. Okay, please, if you have any question, it's not so easy to read the chat while you're speaking, but do not hesitate to speak if needed. Okay.
We'll help you with the chat. When I see the questions, I will be sharing them. I'm Dr. Martin. I'm the co-host on behalf of Dr. Victoria today. So I will monitor the chat and I will respond, yeah?
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I will continue. Sharing data for collaboration is not easy, as you can imagine. Even if it's essential, it's actually hard in practice to gather all this data. So in theory, if you pull all this medical data across institutions and you centralize them, it would give us the power to train better and get more generalizable models. But in practice, there are quite big barriers. So there are regulations first, like, for example, GDPR in Europe, but there are equivalent regulation in other countries, like in the US, for example. In the UK, or also standards. And these standards and regulations strictly protect patient data. And these laws are really crucial because they also make nearly impossible to simply send data like this between the borders or institutions. But well, it makes things quite complicated. There is also lack of incentives. So hospitals and companies may not want to share data if there is no clear benefit to them, especially if they worry, for example, that competitors may profit more than they do. And in this sense, data is often seen as intellectual property. So even if rules allowed it anyway, institutions may hesitate to collaborate. How can you be sure of the right usage of your data? How can you control the usage of this data? And in the end, even if everyone agrees to collaborate, the data itself might not be compatible. As we said previously, there are different hospitals that use different machines, different formats, different standards. And on top of that, sharing a big amount of data can also be complicated. So here is just one quick slide to emphasize the regulations about how we can use the data and AI in healthcare in Europe in particular. So as I said previously, there is a GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. So it's a law introduced in 2018. And it defines health data as a special category that requires with the highest level of protection. So in practice, hospital cannot move patient data or use it for machine learning project without really strong legal safeguards and the consent of the patient as well. And beside that, there is also the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. So this is the first AI law, I think. It does not just focus on data, but on the entire life cycle of AI systems. And healthcare AI in particular fall into the category of high-risk applications. So it means strict requirements for transparency and safety. Okay, so according to GDPR, a sensitive data, it is like any data, genetics, biometric, I don't know, images, whatever you can think, that can lead to identification of a person. And the first way to deal with sensitive data is what we call data anonymization. So basically only this kind of anonymization allows classical centralized training. And data is considered anonymized when it is not possible to identify the person that they related to. So it basically removes all sensitive data from a dataset. And importantly, it is an irreversible process. So for example, you can just put a key instead of a name. You can replace a specific age by a range. You can replace a city name by a region. But as you can imagine, the drawback of that is that it just decreases data quality and specificity. And it can still lead to what is called linkage attacks. That is basically an attempt to re-identify an individual that is in an anonymized dataset by combining the data with other available information. And there is also another drawback that some datasets can be quite complicated to anonymize. Think about an image, for example. What means anonymization of an image? Okay, so there are other ways of doing that, pseudonymization and other methods, but well, we will not discuss that today. Okay, so if we recap quickly so far, you have researchers who want and who need to collaborate because, well, no single hospital or dataset is enough to solve really complex healthcare problems. But traditional collaboration means sharing the data and putting it at one place. But in healthcare, we have seen that this is almost impossible due to privacy regulations, lack of trust, or technical incompatibilities, and so on. So how do we collaborate on data that we cannot share? The answer is federated learning. I mean, this is one answer. And so this is federated learning is trying to address that. And the key idea is that instead of moving the data to the model, we move the model to the data. So in other words, we only share the AI models and we do not share the data anymore. So federated learning is a way of collaboratively training AI models across multiple institutions without ever pulling or sharing the raw data. So it's a form of distributed learning in the sense that the model itself travels to where the data is. And so how does it work in practice? So usually we have a coordinating central server. This can be optional, but we will discuss that later. And several data providers, clients, like for example, hospitals or research centers. And then each client trains a copy of the model on its own local data, which never leaves their secure environment. And once the training on each client is done, then the trained models are sent back to the server, which aggregates them into a new global model that benefits from everyone's knowledge and data set in the end. And so importantly, throughout the whole process, each hospital keeps the full governance over its data. So when we talk about federated learning, it's not just one single approach. In fact, depending on how data is distributed and who is participating, we distinguish several types of federated learning approach, and we will discuss a few of them just now. So first, we can distinguish two main categories that are called cross-device and cross-silo. So in the cross-device scenario, we have a very large number of clients, basically, like millions of phones or IoT devices. And each device only has a small amount of data and low computational power. And at the contrary, in the cross-silo scenario, we have a smaller number of clients, like few hospitals, for example. And each client typically has larger data sets and more computational resources. So the challenge in this scenario is more ensuring collaboration across institutions with sensitive data. We can also classify federated learning between what we call horizontal and vertical data partitioning. This really depends on how the data is partitioned across clients. So in the horizontal partitioning, each client has the same features, but for different patients. So for example, hospital A can have MRI scans for 1,000 patients, and hospital B has also MRI scans for another 1,000 patients. In the vertical scenario, the clients share the same patients, but they record different features about these patients. So for example, a hospital can store all medical images, and the other hospital can store the blood test results, for example. And in this case, they need to share how to identify patients, so like a common patient identifier, so that they know how to match these data sets. So another important aspect of federated learning is the network topology. So basically, it's how the different participants are connected, interact, and how the parameters of the models are shared. So in the star topology, all clients connect to a central trusted server, and the server coordinates the training. It collects the model updates and redistributes the global updates back to the clients. And this is the most common topology in practice. And in the decentralized topology, there is no central server, and instead clients connect directly to each other in a peer-to-peer network. So each client exchanges updates with its neighbors. And this setup avoids having one single failure point. But the drawback is that it's more complicated to manage. So there is another aspect. When we hear federated learning, most people think about training AI models or training models in general without sharing the data. But we do not need to actually do model learning in federated learning. The same principles can apply to a broader set of tasks. And this is what we call federated analytics, which means basically doing collaborative data science without sharing the data. So, for example, we can only compute statistics in a federated way. And there are many useful possibilities with federated analytics. For example, we can do data exploration, such as I just said, getting statistics, getting patient demographics across hospitals without sharing their records. Then for pre-processing, the federated analytics techniques can be used for harmonizing data formats or normalizing the feature in a federated way. It can also be used for standardization, such as align the medical data to some standardized systems or standardized imaging protocols across sites, for example. And finally, it can also be used for model evaluation to check how a model performs across different hospitals without never pulling their test set together. Well, of course, federated analytics also faces some challenges. First, about protecting privacy, because even when you compute simple statistics like averages, you can still leak sensitive information if you don't protect carefully this information. And there are also challenges in the development of distributed algorithms, because we need new methods that work correctly and efficiently in the federated way, let's say. Okay, so to make this a bit more concrete, we will look at this example. It's called the CODA. So it's an open source federated analytic platform that was developed during a COVID-19 pandemic. So CODA platform was designed to allow hospitals and research centers to collaboratively analyze patient data without sharing the records, of course. And so by using CODA, the teams could compute distributed statistics, explore the data sets. They could also train models across multiple institutions. And it's a nice example that shows how federated analytics could allow a rapid research, even during a crisis, without pulling the data centrally. And so this platform also shows that federated learning is not just model training, but you can perform different scientific tasks safely in a federated way. So in all slides, you have, if you want the citation, if you want to afterwards to look more carefully to the examples, of course. Okay, so far we have talked about the general principles of federated learning, and we will now look at some concrete applications. So from hospitals training AI models on medical images to maybe some companies that use the federated learning. So like many emerging technologies, federated learning had an interesting trajectory. So there was first, let's say between 2020 to 2023, like a big boom. So federated learning was trendy, and there were many pilot projects that were launched. And the idea of collaborative AI in healthcare was quite present. And after a few years, the initial hype, let's say, slowed down, and many initiatives stopped, maybe because of technical, regulatory, or even organizational challenges. But now, federated learning is kind of stable with some major frameworks and real deployment examples that are actually used in hospitals or research networks. So here we just gathered some concrete examples of federated learning deployment in examples in healthcare. So first, there was the personal health train that that was one of the early federated learning projects in Europe. It applied distributed learning to over 20,000 lung cancer patients across 8 hospitals in EU. And the idea was to train across multiple sites predictive models for patient outcomes, such as survival or response to radiotherapy, with logistic regression models. Then in 2020, there was the NVIDIA Clara platform that was used for breast density classification, which is really important for assessing cancer risk. So the NVIDIA Clara is a healthcare AI platform that provides tools for building, training, or deploying medical AI models. And in this concrete example, they used a classification model and they trained it with federated learning on 60,000 mammography images from 7 hospitals in both countries, so US and Brazil. Then during the COVID-19 pandemic, so in 2021, federated learning was used again via the NVIDIA Clara platform to predict clinical outcomes of COVID. And so this study trained models on 16,000 medical records and chest X-ray images from 20 sites in the world. And so the goal was to predict outcomes such as mortality, for example. So they used federated learning. And so doing so, the researchers could quickly use the data from a lot of countries without sharing the data and by preserving the patient privacy. And so they showed how the FL technology could enable a rapid collaboration. So next, in 2022, there is the Intel's OpenFL framework that was applied to glioblastoma segmentation in a brain MRI scan. And in this deployment, they used the UNET model. They trained it using a Federated algorithm on 6,000 images on 71 sites in the world. So this was a nice example of large-scale and multi-center collaboration for an image segmentation task. And the final example is Substra-FL, so which goal is to predict the response to chemotherapy in a rare breast cancer. So compared to the other, this study trained a deep learning model on only 500 images with only 2 sites in France. And so they showed that even with extremely limited data, which is the case in the context of rare disease, the federated learning approach allowed the 2 hospitals to collaborate. So this is an example of a more recent study. In this paper, the authors applied federated learning to chest X-ray images for tuberculosis diagnosis across multiple hospitals in 8 African countries. And so there were several challenges highlighted by this paper, such as, well, they faced unstable internet connections and sometimes poor infrastructure, but still they showed that even if the federated learning here didn't achieve like extremely high performance, it still performed more consistently across all hospitals than any model trained on a single site alone. So this means that their federated learning model is more robust and can handle the variability of data from the different sites. So As I said previously, of course, federated learning is not just for healthcare. It has also been used also in industry to solve real-world challenges. We will give you a few examples here. So the first example is done by Siemens. They applied federated learning to detect faults on printed circuit boards. So basically, they detect defects that occur during manufacturing, and these defects can prevent electronic devices from working properly. And so they observed that the models trained on a single factory did not generate well to other factories. So they use federated learning techniques, and they showed how they can now scale their solution across multiple factories, and this avoid normalizing and centralizing the data. And they even mentioned possibilities to maybe extend this approach to different factories that are outside EU, like in China, for example. There is also Roche. So Roche is a pharmaceutical company, and LASA, which is a company specialized in computational toxicology and chemical safety. They collaborated to develop Ephiris, which is a platform for privacy-preserving collaborative training in the pharmaceutical domain. And it was used in computational toxicology applications. And then there is also Amadeus. So Amadeus is a huge company that provides software.
Hello?
And hello? Is anyone trying to say something? Yeah. Is it just me who is hearing a voice, or?
I heard it too. Let's see.
Okay. Anyone? No? Nothing to say? Okay, so I continue. I was talking about Amadeus. Yeah, so it's a big company that provides software and IT services to airlines or to other travel providers. And they use FL for green computing and sustainability. So basically, in their example, different units of the same company could share insights without duplicating the data storage or the computation. And the last example is federating learning applied to self-driving cars. So here, each car collects sensitive driving pattern data from each individual, which cannot be shared directly. And then they applied federated learning to train better models across vehicles while keeping each driver's data private. Okay, so federated learning has several key benefits. So first, it's privacy preserving. And in the context of GDPR or other data protection regulations, it allows collaborative model training without sharing raw data. So in this case, each client retains full governance over its data. And this significantly reduces the risk of data leaks, for example. Second, federated learning take advantage of diverse local data sets because by definition, the global model is influenced by data from multiple sites. The model generalizes better than models trained on a single data set. And just because the diversity of the data set is increased. And in theory, adding a new source of data is also easy as the architecture is designed to scale like naturally. And finally, the federated learning, unlike centralized training, only transmits model updates, and they are supposed to be much smaller than the full data sets. So federated learning is like bandwidth efficient, we say. And this is especially important when we deal with a big data set like large medical images, for example. So of course, federated learning has also important limitations that we need to consider. So it's not a magic solution. It cannot fully prevent data leaks or re-identification. And we will talk about that in more details on Thursday with Francesco. And because the model is updated and shared multiple times during the training, there is risk that sensitive information could be inferred from the parameters. And well, there are some methods that exist to break the privacy of data and model. Then federated learning is in fact more computationally demanding than centralized training. First, because convergence can be slower or less ideal, let's say, compared to centralized learning. And this is especially the case when the local data sets are heterogeneous, but we will talk about that later. And on the other side, the infrastructure cost is entirely on the hospitals or data providers in general, since each site must train its own local model. For example, each hospital must need maybe its own GPU, which is maybe not that obvious for a hospital. And finally, there is also a limitation that data and infrastructure across the sites are often very diverse and heterogeneous. And this may require customized solutions to handle the differences in data formats, in data distribution or data quality. On top of that, the hospitals need to manage the storage of the data, the preprocessing, the computational resources, and this adds a lot of operational complexity. So the federated learning framework needs to adapt to the different IT infrastructure and the different computational power of each site. And this can be, again, really challenging. So if I summarize what I've just said, machine learning has great potential in healthcare. Of course, it can help personalize treatments for individual patients. It can also simplify the daily work of medical professionals and all other reasons we discussed in the first slides. However, there are really important challenges for applying machine learning to healthcare because, as we discussed before, medical data is often scarce, incomplete, heterogeneous across institutions. And on top of that, patient data is highly sensitive, so any AI solution must strictly respect privacy and confidentiality. So this is where federated learning approach comes in, and each hospital in this case keeps its data locally and performs computations on it. Only the results of these computations are shared and aggregated to produce a global model, and this allows collaboration without moving sensitive data. So federated learning is built on this approach. It preserves privacy because the data never leaves the sites. And it comes in many different flavors, as we saw before. It can be adapted to different types of data or network topologies. However, it's important to remember that the federated approach is only a part of the solution, not the whole solution, because the hospitals and the researchers still need to ensure compliance with the different regulations, get approval from the ethic boards, still apply data minimization or anonymization whenever it's possible. And because there are still privacy attacks that exist, the federated learning approach must be made robust and secure. So let's summarize. On the positive side, federated learning is still a first step towards privacy-preserving AI. It also allows high inclusivity due to the diversity of datasets, which improves generalization of models. And in theory, it can scale to as many hospitals as needed, in theory. However, federated learning is not enough to protect patient privacy on its own. It comes with a significant infrastructure and computational costs, which must be handled on the client side, so on the hospital side, for example. And it can also struggle with the high heterogeneity of the data, which can require additional customization or management, let's say. Okay, so now we know what is federated learning, why it's useful, and we will look at how it actually works. And I don't know, Francisco, if you want to to continue, or I can continue if you want. Cool.
No,
okay.
it sounds good. Maybe we can take a quick break to have a chat. And there was already one very nice question in the chat.
Chat.
Sorry, Martin?
There was a question in the chat about anonymization of data and how it's not, effective in data privacy. I know you explained it. I don't know if everyone got time to look at your response. Maybe you can also make it practical, because someone will ask, so if I anonymize data and then you triangulate with other data sources like voting data and maybe national registry data from a pocket of a hospital database, how do you triangulate the data that could lead to de-anonymization of data? So maybe you could quickly, and then we'll explain that, and then we'll take a break, 5-minute break.
Okay, cool. And just so you know, we have a dedicated session to security and privacy on Thursday, as Lucy mentioned. So we will do more of that there. But the idea is we will see some examples that are not specifically related to healthcare data, but there have also been some famous leaks where you have like social security data and like medical insurance data that is leaked, that is stolen, but it's still anonymized in the sense that there's no identifying information. Your name is not on each track on each record of the data that's been leaked. But nevertheless, you can link it with other public sources of data. So, for example, there could maybe be a public record that identifies you as living in a certain zip code, or even like the phone number. If you have a landline, sometimes if you just look at the phone, the starting digits of the phone number, you know more or less where people live. And from there, you can link it to the hospital that they often go to. So when you start having different sources of information that you can combine together, if you are really motivated to figure out the identity of a person, you can do this. It's called a linkage attack, where you use this. You collect as much information as you can, or you can also look at public voter records that identify people as being a particular political party, and all of these help to put the pieces together like a puzzle to finally figure out in the original data that's supposed to be very private and that was leaked, who one person is. I hope I made it a little bit more concrete. And as I said, we will talk about it during the session on Thursday. And a quick shout out, it wasn't actually me who answered, but it was Israel. So thank you very much for participating and helping. So Martin, I don't know if you want to, sorry.
Thank you so much for your response on Israel. And this applies to both structured and unstructured data, that all these techniques can be used retrospectively to triangulate and identify the point source, and that de-anonymizes. Israel, maybe under 30 seconds because we need to take a break and come back at exactly
Yes, I
in
just
5 minutes.
I want to respond to that response that I give on anonymization not being enough. So there is an issue whereby something like a quasi identifiers. So it's a unique attribute for data set. Once it is removed, it makes it let me say stripped off any data. So it makes it very easier to actually link that data to an individual. So I just don't want to go into details of doing that because of cybersecurity concerns and other issues. Then another thing about anonymization not being enough is that the moment some certain information, especially health data, are removed from a particular data set, it makes that data invaluable or useless to even work with. So that's why anonymization somewhat is not the perfect goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. From a medical perspective, I'm learning too many things. I used to think that anonymization was the way to go. Clearly, I'm outdated. I kindly request we take a 5-minute break. We come back on top of the hour. Here in Uganda, it's 5 minutes to 6 p.m. So at exactly, in 5 minutes, we'll resume. See you then.
See you.
See you.
Hello.
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 Francesco, are you able to share your slides?
Let me check again. No. But maybe Lucy can share them in the meantime.
You can
Okay,
share.
sorry, no. No, I think now I'm allowed to. Yeah, now I'm allowed to. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
I don't know
Okay.
if Vicky had introduced you, but I would like you to, take it on. I don't know if Victoria had introduced you. Maybe you could introduce yourself before we go into the presentation.
Absolutely. Yeah. So hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to us today. I am Francesco Cremonesi. I'm from Italy. I'm a colleague of Lucy, basically. So we work in the same French Research Institute. And our focus is on basically medical applications of artificial intelligence. And specifically, we work a lot with medical imaging. And this being said, my background is mostly in computational mathematics, and I actually joined the group because of my prior experience in federated learning, unrelated to medical imaging in the beginning. And so that's why I kind of became one of the, let's say, people who bring forward the federated learning research in our group. So I'll go on with the presentation, I think now. And as I think it was the same with Lucy, don't hesitate to open your mic and interrupt me if you want to ask questions. Otherwise, you can write them in the chat. I saw there were some questions during the break. I'll try to answer them at the end of the presentation, or we'll find some way to get that information to you. But there's some things that I want to make sure that I tell you about federated learning today. So I want to get that over with first. So now we do a little bit of a dive into the algorithmic aspects of federated learning, just to understand how it's implemented, let's say, in practice. And in particular, there is one algorithm which is the most commonly used. It's called federated averaging. And it's it's really the workhorse. I'm Italian, so I would say it's really like the pasta of federated learning. It's like the basic, but it's still very good. So the way that federated averaging works is, first of all, you have to imagine different collaborators who are trying to, collaboratively train a machine learning model. Each collaborator has their own data set, which is different from the others. But there are some similarities. So the data set structure is the same. It's just that the samples, so the subjects, the patients are different. And importantly, the final goal is to achieve a single unique global model that has been trained on all of the data. So that you don't want to end up with different copies of the model for each collaborator. It will be the same machine learning model at the end. But it has to be trained with data from everybody while respecting the data privacy, as Lucy mentioned several times. Okay, so how does the algorithm work? Is, first of all, when we talk about the model or sharing the model or moving the model around, what we mean specifically is moving what are called the weights or the coefficients of the model. So if you're familiar with like university level stats, you can think maybe of a regression model. So in a regression, you have your intercept and you have your slope. These two numbers, the intercept and the slope, are kind of the weights or the coefficients of the regression model. And as you go into more and more complicated models, to machine learning, deep learning, and so on, you still have this property that your model, your machine learning magic that you have, can still be represented by a set of numbers, like the coefficient and the slope, but it will be many more numbers because it's a deep learning. And this is what we are going to share and move around among different collaborators. Okay, so first of all, in federated averaging, we have a central server, and the central server at the very beginning of the algorithm initializes a first random model, which will be very bad. And what they do is the central server communicates this initialized model to every collaborator. So every collaborator receives the same copy of an initial model, W0. And then every collaborator trains this model locally with their own data. So I think you've seen in the lectures last week what it means when you're training a model, so your model weights are being optimized in order to kind of minimize a cost function or loss function, or in general, in order to improve the accuracy of your model on the specific task that you are training. And so what happens in federated averaging is that each collaborator does this training locally by themselves, independently from the others, at the same time or at different times. It doesn't really matter, but they are doing it regardless of what the others are doing, which means that after the training, each collaborator will have a different copy of the model. Now, the important thing to understand here is that the structure of the model, so, for example, in the regression analogy, the fact that you had exactly two coefficients, one which represented the slope and one which represented the intercept. So the structure of the model stays the same, but the numerical values of the weights of the coefficients are changing through this local optimization. So at the end of this step, every collaborator will have their own local copy with different weights of the model based on local, let's say, based on the characteristics of their own local data set. And now they communicate, each collaborator communicates their own private copy, their own personal copy, let's say, of the model coefficients to the central server. And the central server now receives all of these different numerical weights, coefficients for the model. They all have the same structure, but they're all different from each collaborator. And the central server has the difficulty now of how are we going to harmonize them, put them together and combine them into a sort of, again, a global model, unique model, not different copies, a unique one that can be used for making a new iteration of training, or at some point eventually will become the final model. So the way that we do this is called an aggregation step. And so the goal of aggregation is to go from all of the different copies that you've received from each collaborator, each hospital, and you want to combine them into a single unique global model. And the mathematical way that you do this is by doing a weighted average. And this is why the algorithm is called federated averaging. And it's in just the small detail that is important to remember is that it's not just any average, but it's a weighted average. And the weights of the average are proportional to the number of data samples that each collaborator had in their data set, which means that a hospital with a lot of data will be weighted more compared to a hospital with less data. So if you have a hospital with 90% of the data and a hospital with 10% of the data, then when you do the average of their two models, the model of the hospital with 90% of the data will account for 90% of the average. We'll have a weight of 0.9. Okay, so it's a weighted average that we do to go from a lot of different copies of the machine learning model that were trained locally to a unique global model that is kind of representative of everybody. And it might seem, sorry, and it's important to remember that it's a weighted average, weighted by the proportion of samples that you have in your data set compared to all of the other collaborators. And it might seem trivial, but it's very nice in the sense that it has some mathematical properties that I'm not gonna go into detail today, but you can kind of prove that under good assumptions, like lab conditions, let's say, that are never true in practice, but that in theory could be true. Under these theoretical assumptions, you can prove that the federated learning model will converge to a solution that's very, very similar to what you would have if you could have centralized the data instead. So in a sense, federated averaging is like a generalization of classical centralized training, which is what we want. It kind of gives us the theoretical confidence that we are not just training anything. Okay? So for those of you who speak pseudocode or who are more familiar with kind of seeing an algorithm written down, this is what it looks like. Basically, it's an iterative algorithm. This is important to remember. There's it's iterative, inspired by the fact that also when we train a machine learning model in a centralized way, in a classical way, it's also an iterative training. So you do like a lot of steps, a lot of iterations of learning. And in federated averaging and federated learning more in general, it's the same idea, except that some of these steps are done locally by the different clients. And then every once in a while, we stop, we synchronize everybody's contributions, and we do this aggregation step, which is a mean, and a weighted mean, as I said. Okay, so yeah, I hope that this kind of gave you an idea of the algorithm, the main algorithm behind federated learning. And just so I can reiterate the concept, if you've listened carefully, when I spoke about training on the data, it was only in the context of local training. So every hospital does perform some training of the model with their own local data, and the training always only happens locally within each hospital. So the data, as we said multiple times, the data is never shared, it is never moved outside of the hospital. The only thing that is shared with the rest of the world are the weights of the model at the end of the training process, or after like a set amount of iterations that we've decided. So only the weights of the model are shared. And then the only global operation that we do is this aggregation, which in the context specifically of federated averaging is a simple weighted average of the different models from each hospital. Okay, so we can continue our analysis a little bit from an algorithmic point of view to go dive a little bit deeper into what are the limitations of the federated averaging algorithm specifically. So Lucy has already hinted to quite a few of these because they are limitations that are kind of common to every federated learning approach that one can take. And specifically, she talked a lot about data heterogeneity. So basically, let's dive a bit deeper into what it means that heterogeneous data is a limitation for federated learning. So first of all, we have to kind of clarify a little bit what we mean by data heterogeneity. So we've seen that there's different collaborators, different hospitals that are working together. These hospitals, let's say that they have heterogeneous data. Okay, so intuitively, I understand that it means that their data are different. You know, my data are different from the data from another hospital, but in which way they are different can have an impact into how good or how bad your federated averaging or federated learning in general will perform. So the simplest form of heterogeneity that you can find in data is what's called a prior shift or a label distribution shift, skew, whatever. It means that basically imagine that you have a certain quantity of interest that you want to consider, you know, like whatever, some sort of diagnosis that you want to predict, and you're setting up a federated collaboration with different hospitals. And just by looking at the data, you see that in a certain, you know, maybe rural hospital or whatever, or maybe in a pediatric hospital, you'll see that the percentage and the distribution of times that particular diagnosis is found among the full data is different from what you would find in, you know, a different type of hospital that's maybe, you know, like a cancer, specialized hospital for cancer or something like that. So just the fact that different hospitals have different specialties means that you will find the quantity of interest that you want to predict or whatever with your model may be distributed differently in those hospitals. Another very simple way in which you can have heterogeneity is simply that some hospitals will have more data, other hospitals have less data. Okay, this is quite clear. And the most, I would say, subtle one, the most kind of difficult to grasp, it's what's called a covariate shift. So this would be the idea that different hospitals have maybe different demographic pools of patients that go to that hospital. So okay, yeah, I already made the example with the pediatrician hospital and then on. But even like if you think about hospital from a rich part of town and hospital from a poorer part of town, or you know, obviously if we think about a hospital from Asia and a hospital from the Middle East and a hospital from Europe, just the demographics of the people, of the subjects that are contributing to the data will be different. So all of these are different ways in which your data can be heterogeneous. Okay, these are kind of cartoons to summarize what we said. So here you have to look at the pictures. You have cats and dogs, but you also have kind of realistic pictures and cartoonish pictures. And you also have, no, that's it, I think, sorry. And so in the covariate shift, which was a more complicated one, you see that you have 2 dogs and 2 cats in each hospital, in each collaboration. So from the perspective of kind of the quantity of interest that I want to predict, so here I want to guess whether the picture is a picture of a dog or a cat. So the distribution looks the same because you have 2 dogs and 2 cats in each one. But then if a human looks at these pictures, he will immediately identify differences. You know, the ones from ones are like realistic photos of dogs and cats, and the other ones are cartoons. And so this is kind of represents the fact that the underlying data could have different distributions, different demographics, as I was saying before, even though the quantities of interest and so on are distributed in the same way. And then if you look at the label skew, so as we said, the idea here is you have different distributions of the quantity of interest. So you have all of the dogs on one side, all of the cats on the other one, and the quantity skew is pretty obvious. And so what does it mean that data heterogeneity can have a bad impact on federated averaging? So it's not super simple to understand this diagram, but basically the idea here is that the dots and the squares, so every kind of icon that you see represents a model that has been trained. Okay, and you have you have one trajectory for client 1, another trajectory for client 2. And if you follow a little bit the training, starting from the X in the middle, let's say the black X, you'll see that in a federated learning approach, first of all, what happens is that each client does their local training. So from X, you go to Y1 for client 1, and you go to Y2 for client 2. If you remember, this was the workflow that we said. You had an initial point, which was the same, and then each client did their own local training. So each client diverges. Now they have their own, let's say, local copy of the model. And then when you do the aggregation, you reach a sort of middle ground, this average between the two, which is the gray dot over there. And what happens is, basically, if your data are very heterogeneous among the different clients, the different hospitals, then what will happen is that the two will diverge quite a lot during each local training. And then when you do the average, you end up somewhere in the middle, but somewhere in the middle is not a very meaningful space for your model to be in, because it's in the middle of like this big landscape of complicated loss function that could be, could be anything. So if your local training means that each client's model stays close to the other clients, then when you do the average, you will have something that's meaningful and that's also like in a good area of this big landscape of optimization that you are exploring. But if they drift far apart, then sure, you end up somewhere in the middle, but somewhere in the middle doesn't mean anything. And in this case, in practice, what you see is that federated averaging will have very bad convergence, or will have like even no convergence at all. So it's also something important to know is that the centralized approach means that your model kind of, if you set the correct learning rate and everything, your model will converge. But when you're in a federated, sorry, not your model, but your training process will converge. But when you're in a federated scenario, even if you have the perfect learning rate, the perfect hyperparameters, everything, there's still a chance that just because of how the data is distributed across different clients, different hospitals, your algorithm may still not converge. So that's kind of a big bummer when you're experiencing that. Okay, we're already kind of short on time, so I will skip this kind of less meaningful limitations of federated learning. Scaling the number of clients. There's also technical reasons why sometimes it doesn't make sense to compute averages among different models and so on. But what I want to really emphasize again is that when we do federated learning, we can take inspiration from algorithms that are used during centralized learning, but then we still have to kind of adapt them to the federated scenario, and we will encounter, inevitably, we will encounter new challenges that were not present in the centralized scenario. And as I said, federated averaging is really like the 99.9% federated learning algorithm. There is a lot of research into how federated averaging can be improved. and correction terms, and computer scientists go crazy with this kind of things. But at the end of the day, in the practical world, federated averaging will do the job 99% of the time. When doesn't it do the job? Well, one of the big issues with federated averaging is that if your data are very different, so this notion of data heterogeneity, then federated averaging will converge slowly or even not converge at all. So this can be kind of a big issue. On the other hand, federated averaging is nice because it's very simple to implement. And as I tried to hint in the beginning, if you have like the perfect theoretical conditions, then you can prove that it converges to a solution that is very similar to what you would have obtained by centralizing the data. Okay, I think I would rather stop here because there's like a whole new chapter coming up. And I don't know, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to go into it now. We can maybe take some questions, or Martin, let me know if I can go over 10 minutes, then maybe I can do another chapter, but I don't know how strict we should be on the timing.
Thank you so much. Like we said, this is just an introduction. It's very exciting. And for those who are not like data scientists or computer scientists, but are working within, anything to do with data, I think this is quite an interesting topic. I'm not seeing any questions within. There are a few questions to do with, and I think you answered them. This was to do with weighting. Peter Anthony was asking, is percentage based on the data the only strategy for averaging the weight of all models, or are there any other ways? And I think some of these are going to be upcoming within the next modules. And Frank was asking incentives. For example, who funds these federated learning companies that you're talking about? I don't think that the companies, it's just these are mechanisms of leveraging data in different pockets, but in a very structured and controlled way. We always say that there's no data in the medical field. It's very hard to access data, and so using federated learning and the techniques being shared here, we don't always have to share the data. We can use it wherever it is by leveraging federated learning, and this is one of the safest ways for now, and I know more research is going into this. I would like to invite 2 more questions before we close the session. I know we are running short on time, so maybe 2 more questions. Anyone, please put up your hand and go ahead and ask, please. Anyone? Am I seeing the hands? Oh. Anyone with a question? Or are we now federated learning experts? All right.
Hello,
Yes,
Frank?
Yes, Frank, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I have a question. Now that I've shared the model that we are using here of the shared averages, I'm wondering, because for each training, we are going to have a change in how the model is. Let me say the hyperparameters, we are having changes in the loss function, in the convergency. So how is this monitored? For example, how does it impact each of the stations that is training and using the model on their own? Say if we have 5 stations, and then one station brings in data that skews the model, is it going to affect the other 4 stations immediately? Do they get to see how the model is performing and maybe choose to integrate it into, like an update into their model, something like that?
Yeah, so I have 2 answers for that, and then Lucy, you can also jump in if you want. But so there's, from an algorithmic point of view, as soon as you have a new participant, a new collaborator, their data can be immediately introduced into the training. And so maybe I didn't emphasize this enough, but it's really an iterative process with multiple rounds. So you do one round of training, you aggregate the data with the federated, with the averaging, and then you basically repeat this process multiple times until you are satisfied that your model has converged. And so in these repetitions, you can always at any point embark new clients or have new participants, or have different participants that are left out at some point. There's a whole area of research for federated learning that I didn't speak about, which is dealing with sampling clients. So the idea that you don't always have the full set of participants collaborating at each round, but rather you have different subsets at different rounds. So this is from an algorithmic perspective. The information from new clients is immediately injected into the, let's say, iterative process. There is also one thing that I quickly would like to touch on, which is that federated learning is also a very big kind of engineering endeavor. It's not just about research and algorithms. And you were asking in your question about monitoring the performance and so on. And this is a very big point right now in people and companies and even academia who are developing federated learning frameworks, like we are doing as well. How having like a proper set of tools that allows to monitor how the training is going, and in particular allowing each hospital to monitor how the whole training is going, making sure that their data is never leaked, is not it's not trivial at all. But at the same time, it's very interesting, and it's a feature that everybody would like. And so it's a very active sort of area of development. So I hope I answered your question, and thank you. It was a very nice question.
Question. We 3 minutes, I think, on top of time. I'd like to Dr. Vicky, are you there? So, thank you so much for this introductory lecture and session. We really are looking forward to tomorrow and Thursday. I request all of us to make it on time, to be early. We had, I think, only 68 people total. It would be good if the rest of you can really, get your team members to attend early, because this is exactly what we're going to be using in our exercises. And it's very critical for us to make sure that we are learning the skills. So I'd like to thank Lucy and Francesco. I hope I'm pronouncing the names well.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you so much, and see you tomorrow.
Maybe if I can add quickly something.
Yes, please.
Yeah, because tomorrow we plan to do a hands-on tutorial with FedBiomed. And so we wanted just to ask everyone to, if it's possible, have a Google account, because we will use a Google Colab notebook. So if some of you don't have, if you can create it. And if you don't, well, in the worst case, you will just show us playing, but you won't be able to work on the tutorial. That's it. This is for tomorrow afternoon.
Thank you so much. I hope you've taken note of that, please. Tomorrow is more practical. So if you don't have a Google account, please make sure you have one, because that's where we're going to be having our practical sessions tomorrow. Okay? If you have any challenges, please reach out to us. You know the emails to write to. Our facilitators are always ready to help. So Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.